I boarded up the dog door the same night I called 911, but I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear it swing open. I'm 38 now, living in a townhouse outside Portland, Oregon. This happened 6 years ago, back when my son was still small enough to fall asleep on my shoulder halfway through a movie. I don't live in that house anymore. I tell people I moved because it was too much upkeep for one person. That's true. Just not the whole truth. The house was nearly 100 years old. Tall ceilings, original wood floors, old-growth trees leaning close enough to scrape the shingles when the wind picked up. It had character. That's what the realtor called it. What that really meant was it never stopped making noise. I had always been afraid of the dark. Not in a dramatic way. Just the kind of person who checks the back seat before driving off. When I was a kid, a neighbor boy used to stand outside my bedroom window at night. My parents handled it, but the habit of listening for things never really left me. So when we bought that house, I told myself the sounds were normal. Radiant heat ticking in the walls. Branches brushing the siding. The back gate that never latched quite right, clanking open when the wind shifted. After my husband and I separated, I kept the house. He kept the dog. That part felt practical at the time. What I didn't think about was the dog door in the back kitchen wall. It was oversized for our old lab mix, installed years before we moved in. Without the dog, it was just an open flap of thin plastic leading straight into my kitchen. I meant to replace it. I really did. That fall, it was just me and my son most evenings. We'd eat early, pick a movie, spread blankets on the living room floor. I kept lights on longer than necessary. I told myself it was for him. The night it happened started like any other. Dusk settling in. A cartoon playing too loud. My phone dying at the worst time, which was typical for me. I remember feeling mildly annoyed as I walked toward the kitchen to find the charger. I remember thinking, very clearly, that the house was unusually quiet. Not silent. Just wrong somehow. Like the usual background noises had stepped back. And that was before I looked out the window and realized someone had already been sitting in my yard for long enough to get comfortable. The first time I saw her, I almost convinced myself she wasn't there. It was early October, 2018. A Tuesday, I think. Around 6:40 in the evening. The light outside had that thin, gray tone it gets right before it gives up for the night. My son was in the front room watching a movie, the volume up too high, and I was in the kitchen trying to plug my phone in before it died completely. That was when I felt it. Not fear exactly. More like a shift. The kind of full-body awareness you get when you realize you've missed something important. I turned toward the backyard window without knowing why. The gate was open again. That didn't surprise me. It never latched properly. What surprised me was the figure sitting cross-legged in the grass, about 10 feet from the house. She was facing the kitchen. Hood up. Dark sunglasses on, even though the sun was nearly gone. Hands resting loosely on her knees. Completely still. For a second I assumed it was a teenager cutting through yards. We lived on a quiet residential street. People wandered sometimes. But she wasn't walking. She wasn't on her phone. She wasn't looking around. She was looking at the house. At first, I thought she might be looking past it. Or at her reflection. Or maybe I was seeing a shadow wrong. I stepped closer to the sink to get a better angle. She didn't move. Not when I stepped into clear view. Not when I leaned slightly toward the glass. Not even when I was certain that, from where she sat, she could see me clearly inside. That was the part that unsettled me. If someone realizes they've been seen, they react. They wave. They look away. They stand up and pretend they were tying a shoe. There's always a correction. She didn't correct. I told myself she might be mentally unwell. Or waiting for someone. Or confused. I told myself not to escalate it in my head. I locked the back door anyway. It was automatic, something I did without thinking. Then I noticed something else. The plastic flap of the dog door shifted slightly. Just once. Not swinging open. Just moving, like something brushed it from the outside. There was no wind. I remember staring at that flap longer than I stared at her. I tried to reason it out. Old hinges. Pressure difference. Air moving through the house. The heater kicking on. Any explanation felt better than the alternative. When I looked back up, she was still sitting there. Still facing the house. Still completely motionless. And that was the moment I understood that she wasn't just in the yard. She was waiting. I didn't call the police right away. That's the part that still bothers me. When you picture something like that, you imagine immediate panic. You imagine someone screaming, grabbing their child, running. That isn't what happened. I locked the back door. I stood there for a few seconds. I told myself she would leave now that she knew she'd been seen. People don't just sit in strangers' yards after being noticed. Except she did. That first week after we moved in, months earlier, I noticed how often the back gate swung open. I'd close it before bed. In the morning it would be ajar again. The latch was old. The fence slightly warped. I blamed the wind. Portland gets unpredictable gusts that time of year. It made sense. The second week, I started noticing the kitchen felt colder than the rest of the house at night. Not dramatically. Just enough that I would pull my sweater tighter when I went in for water. The dog door was thin plastic. It probably let air through. I meant to tape it off once the dog was gone, but life kept moving and it didn't feel urgent. By week 3, I had a routine. Before bed, I would check the back door twice. Once casually. Once again after brushing my teeth. I'd glance at the dog door from across the room. Not directly. Just enough to confirm it was still closed. I began leaving the light above the stove on overnight. I told myself it was for convenience. I also started avoiding the kitchen after dark unless absolutely necessary. It wasn't a conscious decision. I just found reasons not to go in there. If my son wanted a snack after 8 p.m., I'd suggest something from the pantry instead of the fridge. If I needed water, I'd get it earlier in the evening. Small adjustments. Practical. Easy to justify. Nothing dramatic ever happened during those weeks. No break-ins. No figures in the yard. No alarms. Just repetition. The gate would be open some mornings. Not wide. Just unlatched. I'd close it without comment. Once, I found the trash bin lid lifted, even though I was certain I'd pressed it down. I blamed raccoons. We had them in the neighborhood. Twice, I woke up around 2:17 a.m. for no clear reason. No noise I could identify. Just awake. Listening. The house would be still, except for the faint tick of the heat pipes cooling. I would lie there and count slowly to 30 before letting myself relax. I started keeping my phone fully charged at night. That wasn't something I used to worry about. I also began checking the dog door before unlocking the back door in the mornings. Not opening it. Just making sure the flap was still resting flat. By the time that Tuesday evening came around, these checks had already become part of me. Quiet habits layered over routine. I never said out loud that they were about safety. I framed them as practicality. Single parent. Old house. Be cautious. But looking back, I think something in me had already understood that the house wasn't just noisy. It was responding. And the night I saw her sitting in the yard, I realized I had been adjusting to something long before I had proof it was there. The pattern broke the night she stood up. Until then, everything had been predictable. The open gate. The colder kitchen. Waking at 2:17 a.m. small things I could explain if I needed to. But after I saw her in the yard that Tuesday evening, something shifted. When I locked the back door and stepped away from the window, I assumed she would leave. That's how these situations are supposed to go. You're seen, you move on. Embarrassment does the rest. I waited about 30 seconds before looking again. She was still there. Only now she was closer. Not dramatically. Maybe 3 or 4 feet nearer to the house. Still cross-legged. Still facing the window. Still perfectly upright, hands resting loosely on her knees. I hadn't seen her move. That detail has stayed with me more than anything else. The dispatcher later asked if I was certain I hadn't looked away longer than I thought. I probably had. A few seconds. Enough time for someone to shift position. That's reasonable. That's human. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like she had simply changed locations. My son called out from the living room asking for water. His voice sounded too loud in the quiet house. I told him to wait a minute. When I glanced back outside again, the yard was empty. Relief came first. Immediate and physical. My shoulders dropped. I remember actually exhaling. Then I noticed the gate was closed. Not just resting against the frame. Fully latched. I hadn't gone outside. The wind hadn't picked up. It was a small detail. Easy to miss. Easy to rationalize. Maybe she closed it behind her. Maybe it had finally caught properly. But the air in the kitchen felt heavier. Thicker somehow. The dispatcher kept me on the line as she asked if I could check the yard from another window without being seen. I remember crouching awkwardly near the dining room window, trying to angle myself just enough to see the back steps. That was when I saw her again. Not in the grass. She was sitting on the back step now. Right in front of the dog door. Her arm was extended toward it, resting loosely beside her, almost absent-mindedly. The plastic flap moved once, slow and deliberate, as if pushed from the outside. Then it moved again. Inward. I told myself it was wind. I told myself it was gravity. I told myself I was misjudging the angle. But there was no wind. The trees were still. And the motion wasn't random. It was measured. The dispatcher's voice sounded distant as she asked me to confirm whether the door was locked. I realized, in that moment, that I had been so focused on the deadbolt that I hadn't thought about the one opening in the house that had never really been secured. The dog door wasn't blocked. Not taped. Not boarded. Just a thin flap between my kitchen and whoever was sitting on the other side of it. I stood up slightly, trying to see more clearly through the glass. And that was when she stood up too. Not abruptly. Not aggressively. Just smoothly. And stepped close enough that her hooded face filled the lower half of the kitchen window. She didn't knock. She didn't try the handle. She simply stood there. Looking in. And that was the first moment I stopped trying to explain it. I should have run to the front door the second she stood up. Instead, I tried to see her more clearly. That's the decision I keep replaying. The dispatcher was still asking questions, her voice thinned through the dying battery of my phone. "Can you confirm where she is now?" she said. I remember thinking that if I could just get a better look, if I could describe her more precisely, it would make the situation smaller. More manageable. A person. Not a presence. I stepped closer to the kitchen window. It felt like walking into cold water. The air near the back door was noticeably cooler than the rest of the house. My bare feet registered it first against the tile. I told myself it was the old insulation. The draft from the dog door. Nothing else. She was right there now. Hood pulled low. Oversized sunglasses reflecting the yellow light from above my stove. I couldn't see her eyes. I couldn't see much of her face at all. Just stillness. I leaned slightly to the left, trying to catch her features at a different angle. The glass separated us by maybe half an inch. I could see my own reflection layered over her silhouette. That's when I noticed her hand. It wasn't resting at her side anymore. It was inside the dog door. Not fully. Just her fingers. The plastic flap bent inward around them. Slow. Controlled. Like she was testing the space. The dispatcher said something about grabbing my son and moving to a secure room. I heard it. I understood it. But for a split second, I hesitated. Because I needed to know if she could fit through. That thought, clear and practical, is what still unsettles me. I took one more step toward the door. Close enough that if she pushed harder, the tips of her fingers might have touched the inside tile. The flap shifted again. Further this time. A soft, deliberate sound. Not wind. Not random. A decision doesn't always feel dramatic when you make it. It felt almost quiet. I backed away from the window. Turned. And walked quickly down the hallway toward the living room to get my son. I didn't look back at the kitchen as I lifted him. I didn't check the yard again. I didn't verify whether her hand had gone any further. I just heard it. The unmistakable sound of the dog door opening wider behind me. And that was when I chose to leave the house. I didn't see her come inside. That's what unsettles me most now. I grabbed my son from the living room floor. He was confused, still half focused on the movie. I told him we were going to play a quick game at the neighbor's house. My voice sounded steady. Almost normal. Behind me, from the direction of the kitchen, I heard the dog door settle against the tile. Not slam. Not swing wildly. Just settle. Like something had passed through it and allowed it to fall back into place. I didn't turn around. The hallway felt longer than usual. Narrower. My grip on my son tightened without me realizing it. The house was strangely quiet. The cartoon audio still played faintly from the television, cheerful and out of place. As I reached the front door, I noticed something small but wrong. The air inside felt warmer. Not dramatically. Just enough that the back of the neck chill I'd felt near the kitchen was gone. The temperature felt even. Balanced. As if the draft had been corrected. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The street was calm. Early evening traffic in the distance. A porch light across the road flickering on automatically. Nothing unusual. I crossed the street barefoot, my son on my hip, and pounded on my neighbor's door harder than I meant to. When they let us in, I remember the smell of food. Laughter from a dinner party. The normalcy of it felt disorienting. I stood near their window, staring back at my house. The front door I'd left open hung wide, unmoving. The kitchen light was still on. From that angle, I couldn't see the dog door. I couldn't see the back steps. But something about the house looked occupied. Not visibly. Just settled. Police arrived within minutes. I stayed across the street, answering questions from a distance while trying not to let my son see my hands shaking. 2 officers approached from the side yard with flashlights. They disappeared briefly behind the fence. There was no shouting. No struggle. No urgency. When they reappeared, she was walking between them. Calm. Hood still up. Sunglasses still on, though it was fully dark now. Her expression was neutral. Not angry. Not distressed. One of the officers told me they found her sitting on the back step. Her arm extended through the dog door, moving it slowly back and forth. They didn't say she tried to enter. They didn't say she spoke. Just that she was there. I went back inside with them to retrieve my cat. The kitchen floor was clean. Nothing broken. Nothing overturned. But the plastic flap of the dog door hung slightly bent inward, as if it had been pushed too far and didn't quite return to shape. I stared at it longer than I should have. Because even though she'd been outside when they found her, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already crossed that threshold. I don't remember sleeping that night. I remember boarding the dog door shut. One of the officers suggested it. I found an old piece of plywood in the garage and screwed it over the opening from the inside. The drill bit slipped once. My hands wouldn't steady. The sound of metal grinding into wood echoed too loudly in the kitchen. By the time I finished, it was past midnight. My son slept through everything at the neighbor's house. They kept him until I told them it was handled. I brought him back home because I didn't know what else to do. The police said she would be taken in for evaluation. They used the word trespassing. They used the word nonviolent. They didn't use the word why. Inside, the house felt different. Not safer. Just altered. The plywood covered the dog door completely. No visible gap. No draft. But the kitchen still felt slightly colder than the hallway. I told myself it was residual fear. Adrenaline leaving my system. I checked every room twice before putting my son to bed. Closets. Under beds. The basement door. Windows locked. Back gate latched. I stood in the yard with a flashlight for a full minute before coming back in, just to prove to myself that there was no one there. I don't remember falling asleep, but I remember waking up at 2:17 a.m. Exactly 2:17. I didn't hear anything at first. Then, faintly, from the kitchen, I heard a soft, rhythmic sound. Not the flap of plastic. That was sealed. This was duller. Wood against wood. Slow. Measured. I lay there listening for nearly 30 seconds before I realized what it resembled. Knuckles. Not knocking. Just resting. Then dragging slightly. Across the plywood. I told myself it was contraction. Old beams adjusting. Temperatures shift overnight. Houses settle. Wood expands and contracts. That explanation carried me until morning. At daylight I checked the board. No visible damage. No splintering. The screws were tight. Everything intact. We moved 3 weeks later. I told friends it was too much house for one person. Too much maintenance. Too many repairs waiting to happen. All of that was true. I didn't tell them that every night after that, until we left, I woke up at 2:17 a.m. And every night, the house was already awake with me. I live in Beaverton now. A newer townhouse. Built in 2012. Clean lines, tight insulation, no history in the walls. It's been 6 years. My son is 10. He doesn't remember much about the old house. Just that we had a big backyard and a cat who liked to sit in the kitchen window. He doesn't remember crossing the street barefoot. He doesn't remember the officers. I've never corrected him. Most days, my life feels ordinary again. I work from home. I keep the porch light on at night. I replaced every lock within a week of moving here. There are no dog doors. There never will be. But some habits stayed. I still wake up around 2:17 a.m. Not every night. Just often enough that I check the clock before I check anything else. And I always check something else. In this house, the back door is solid. No flaps. No openings. Just a deadbolt and a handle. But I still find myself standing in the kitchen some nights, staring at the lower half of that door. Listening. It's never loud. Sometimes it's just a soft shift in the air. A faint change in pressure, like someone standing on the other side without touching anything. Once or twice, I've heard something that sounded like fingertips brushing lightly across the surface. I've never opened it. I don't look through the peephole at night anymore either. I don't know when that started. I just stopped. Rationally, I know what happened back then. A trespasser. A woman who shouldn't have been there. The police handled it. We moved. End of story. But the part that doesn't settle is the timing. Because even in this house, in a different city, with no yard and no fence and no dog door at all, sometimes, at exactly 2:17 a.m., I hear something gently testing the bottom of my back door.